I'm Sandra D. Robinson, and welcome to The Divorce Project. Are you or someone you know going through a divorce or a custody battle? Well, this show offers legal guidance and caring solutions to help you create a healthy family dynamic as you're going through divorce and post-divorce. Soon, you'll meet the host of The Divorce Project, family law attorney Barry Fisher. Each show, Barry chooses family specialists, and he takes parents and children, and they talk about divorce. They focus on the positive outcomes and the wonderful mindsets that can happen when we all work together.
Hello, welcome to The Divorce Project. We have a wonderful show for you today. Thank you for joining us. We have Dr. Stephen Petrus and his wife, Dr. Gina Petrus, and we have Kate Christensen. Dr. Petrus, both are clinical psychologists dealing with children and adolescent issues, and Kate Christensen, who regularly works with the Divorce Project as a production assistant, went through a divorce when she was 11 years old with her sister, and she's going to give us some of the insights about what occurred to her. So, and most of the show, if we have to give it a topic, it's going to be about communication. I'm Barry Fisher. I'm a family law attorney. I specialize in family law cases and divorce cases and custody cases in Los Angeles, California. So today I'd like to open up the dialogue with you, and I'll start with Dr. Stephen Petrus first. And the question I have is, how important is communication when the parents have decided to have a divorce?
I think communication is extremely important. And to communication, I would add authenticity. And what I mean by that is being honest with your children about what's going on. They don't need too much in the way of all the details, but they do need to know what's going on. And a lot of times what happens when parents try to hide what's going on, it can make the child feel kind of crazy because they're seeing one thing. Kids are very perceptive. They're seeing one thing but being told something else. So I think communication and authenticity are very important.
Okay, so authenticity and telling the truth about what's really happening.
Absolutely.
Now, parents are afraid to tell the truth. You know, how would you advise the parents to go about breaking the news to the children that they're about to go through a divorce?
I think the important thing is to be consider the child's developmental level. So obviously a 5-year-old will be very different than talking to your teenager. But what's important about it is to create a space where your child can be heard, they can ask questions. A lot of times parents shy away from that, partly because they don't know how their child's going to react, or they may think that they'll become emotional and their child's going to see them break down, or their child's going to reject them. So sharing as much information that's necessary, but again, being, you don't want to tell your children too much or things that they don't need to know, and you want to be careful about the purpose of the communication. Is it to turn the child against their parent, or is it to just alleviate some of their anxieties? Because kids will fill in what they don't know. So if you're not communicating anything, they're just imagining all kinds of things that may never come to be, but they're going to be anxious about it.
Now, Kate, you were 11 years old when you went through the divorce with your parents. And did you feel that they prepared you for it before you went through it?
We had a conversation about it, and it was basically cut and dry. It was just like, this is what's happening, just so you know. And for me, I wish there was more of a conversation, but there wasn't. It was just like, just so you know, this is happening, and it was just to be prepared. But it wasn't any details of, it was like, why, what's happening, is it my fault? And so there was a conversation, but not much detail.
So one of the thoughts you had was that it was your fault. And did you discover, how long did it take you to discover that it wasn't your fault?
Oh, it's been years. As a child, you have a different perspective on things. And so when it's all said and done, you can kind of shuffle through things differently. And so it's hard to tell. It took years. After you go through stages, anger, resentment, and then finally you get to a point where you can process everything, you're okay with everything. But it wasn't until my late teens that I actually understood.
One of the interesting things in the courtrooms that's happening, just recently the California legislature passed or amended the law and said that any child over 14 years old is allowed to testify in a court proceeding. Before that, it had to be, the judge had to see it was in the best interest of the child. Maybe they would do a chambers conference. Maybe they would have an interview by an independent psychologist, and the psychologist would come in. They still protect the children that are under 14. They sometimes allow them to testify if there's a very good reason. Now, you testified in your case.
I did.
And could you describe for us how they set it up for you?
It was in a different room, so while the court hearing was going on, my sister and I sat in the other room. There was a camera, and there was somebody asking us questions, and it was nerve-wracking because we were on camera and we knew that they were in the other room, and so I think that happened. We were nervous about that.
Did it make you feel like you had to choose between one parent or the other?
I think it did. Now that I look back on it, I felt pressured because it was right. They were just in the other room. We had all come to the courtroom together, and we all left together. And so, being 11 years old, I felt very pressured to choose one way or over the other.
Now, you both counsel children and parents in your practice. What about the child that comes in and is all of a sudden, since the divorce started, is not doing well, is failing in school, is having trouble paying attention, is just having difficulty getting in trouble? Have you seen that in your practice?
Absolutely, that happens a lot, and partly when child, especially as we were talking about communication, if they haven't really had a chance to really express what's going on for themselves or to identify some of the feelings they're experiencing, they'll show it through through behaviors, and oftentimes you'll see that directly in terms of school behavior. You'll see that with kids getting involved with drugs, maybe, but it's kind of an expression of what's going on with them internally. They just haven't had the opportunity to express, and so that's the way that they're expressing some of these things.
So how important is it for the child to feel that the child is being heard?
It's an excellent question. It's extremely important. The child has to have an outlet to express their feelings. And what Kate was talking about earlier kind of really hits the nail on the head in terms of, there's this push-pull between the parents. And a lot of times the parents get caught up with their anger and start to use the child as a communication tool between parents. And it's very confusing to the child. And they don't really have an outlet, somebody to talk to. And I think it provides a lot of support where they can kind of open up in a forum where there's not being judged and they don't feel that pressure to align with one parent versus another parent.
So you believe that all children going through a divorce should go into therapy?
Not necessarily, because for some children and teenagers, they have really strong support systems. It could be family members, it could be coaches, it could be the spiritual community. So they have opportunities to be able to express what they're feeling. Sometimes, though, that doesn't happen, or the kids maybe part of the going through a high conflict divorce sometimes is that they are kind of taken away from some of their support systems. So like in Kate's situation, maybe she didn't have access to people that in the past she would have been able to go to. So it could be therapy if that young person doesn't have those kinds of outlets, but it can definitely be done within the family system, within the community system as well.
As long as there's a support system for the child can make it through this process.
I think we have to look at the support system. So if somebody comes into our office, we look at the support system they have set up. We also look at what they may have been enduring, whether it's something like anxiety or depression before divorce came up or separation came up. Because if you have a child who's very anxious by nature anyway, or depressed, that plays a role in it also, and we also have to factor that into how the divorce is going to further affect them.
Now, Kate, when you went through this process, did you feel like you were heard?
I don't think so. I wasn't given an option. It was like this is what's happening, and you deal with it. I mean, you're going to have to deal with it because we've decided, and there wasn't much conversation about it throughout the whole process. I mean, there was a lot of emotional things that were happening during it, and we talked about, oh, we're going to see the judge today. Is there anything you want us, or we would talk to the social worker, and they would tell us that, but there wasn't any conversation.
Here's my best advice. If you're in court, try to settle, try to work out a parenting plan that works for your family. You don't want a stranger. The judge, he's trained, he'll do it, he'll decide. Or maybe she'll decide. It could be a female judge. But why let a third party decide what's completely within your power?
Exactly.
And I see this all the time, that couples are fighting. Oh, I want to have an extra day. Oh, I want to have that weekend. Oh, I want to have Christmas. Oh, no, I want to be able to go out of state. And the other parent's going, no.
Right.
And
That's right.
it sets up this scenario where the child is a ping pong ball.
That's right.
And it's very unfair to the child. It's unfair to the parents. But the parents are so angry at each other that they're fighting. But if you go into court and then you have to get the judge to decide, you're going to end up with something very different. Neither one of the parents are going to like it, and maybe the child's not going to like it either. In Kate's situation, it was very unique because it was her mother litigating with your grandparents.
Correct.
Your grandparents were saying, it's best if you stay with us. We have better resources, so we're going to come into court and fight for you.
Right.
And that was what the battle was, right?
Yes.
And how did it turn out?
Well, my mother won the custody case, and at the end, she felt very intimidated after everything that happened, and so she didn't give the custody over, but we felt more comfortable after everything had been said and done because our support system was with our grandparents, and the family that we knew was through them. And so we ended up, I grew up with my grandparents.
Interesting. And that was from age 11?
Yes.
And Barry, if I could add something to what you were saying, what's important too is that, as parents going through a divorce, there's so much emotion. There's anger, there's hurt, there's guilt, there's shame, there's all kinds of things. And then when you're placing decisions about your child, because for the most part, parents, I think, want what's in the best interest of their child, but they're so caught up in their own emotion. And then when you're kind of passing over decisions about your child to somebody who's not a part of your family, that just adds to parents' distress, and it just kind of exacerbates all of the negative emotional feelings. And that's what in the end impacts your parenting, which impacts your communication, because you're kind of checked out or you're dealing with your own stuff that you can't be present. But regardless of your divorce, you still have to be a parent, and those things are essential.
It's very good advice. What I've seen in all of the cases, every one of us has a childhood that was different. And depending on who our parents were and how our childhood went, we developed a different personality. And within that personality, we all have pathology or some issues, insecurities, fears, lack of confidence. So there's a whole array of things that each person has. Now, what I noticed is that when people go through a divorce, all those things get triggered.
Absolutely.
Because, they're afraid, they feel betrayed, they're angry, and they have to go through these series of emotions to adjust to this situation. And the problem is that their issues from childhood come up, and now, you're dealing with two children that are adults, trying to take care of their children. And it becomes really problematic when the people can't see themselves.
That's right. One of the big things we see come up in what you're talking about is rejection. So you have parent A feeling rejected from parent B. And that gets put out there. And what happens is when the anxiety becomes too much, it spills over. And then all of a sudden you have a child who's feeling rejected, talked at. It feels overly punitive, and that can cause shame. And then the shame can be damaging because it makes the child start to feel really bad about themselves. And that can be traumatic for the child or children going through the divorce.
I often tell parents come in to me and say, what's going to happen with my children? I said, well, I can tell you, you're going to affect their life for the rest of their life if you divorce. And nobody escapes. The casualties of divorce are the children. And every child that I've seen gets affected. They come out different as a result of having to go through this divorce. Do you ever counsel your parents how to minimize this effect?
Absolutely. I think what's really important through all of this is because what we do know that a protective factor in all of this is parents' adjustment. So if a child has at least one parent who's reasonably adjusted, who's effective enough in their parenting, competent enough in their parenting, attentive enough to the kids, the outcomes are better than those kids that don't receive that. So it's really about helping parents to find their own support, whether it be through therapy or some of the other things we talked about, but not utilizing, especially like teenagers or even maybe close to Kate's age, sometimes parents will utilize their kids as their source of support. So not only is that child viewing the conflict, but they're also feeling responsible for taking care of their parent.
Right.
And then that again minimizes their ability to be honest about what they're feeling, because even kids who have been, maybe they've come to our practice years after all of the court hearings and testimony, will still be very afraid of saying anything about any parent because they're afraid that may come back, they may have to go to court one day again, so they're not comfortable expressing their feelings, so they keep it inside. Or they always check it, are you going to tell my parent I said this? And because also too, they have to be very careful, at least the kids have to be careful about expressing how they feel because they don't want to hurt a parent. So if I say I had a great time with my dad, mom's going to get hurt because she thinks I love dad more. Or if I talk about a problem I had with dad, now she's going to take him back to court because we had this small problem. So there's no expression of what's going on.
It's a very powerful picture when father and daughter, or mother and daughter, come in and the mother sitting there weeping or the father and the child sitting there holding them. It's a very, very powerful picture to see that when the child becomes the caretaker or parentified.
And Kate, did you become the caretaker of your mother in any way?
In a way, I felt like I was an outlet for her. I was the oldest, so I felt, naturally we talked about emotions, and she would, I think, her support system wasn't there, so I became that support system. And so I heard a lot of things that I probably shouldn't have known.
That's right.
And so I think that affected, the outcome for me.
And, now you're an adult. Has it affected your ability to have relationships?
I don't believe so.
How has it affected you, if you're aware?
I feel like being the oldest, it definitely prepares you for being a caretaker. Because especially if you have younger siblings, I felt that was a natural role for me. I don't feel like it has affected my relationships. I feel like I tend to stay away from people who do need to be carried or need more emotional support because of my, things I've gone through. I feel like it was traumatizing enough to have to see my mother in that position.
Well, it sounds like you did a good job from healing. You're more objective
so.
now, right?
Yes.
You're not going to take on that needy person.
Well, when you get older, you process things differently, and you can see it as an adult. Adult's perspective is very different than a child's perspective, and you look back and you can process things and go through things differently. And, the anger has gone away. And so I think after the anger has gone away, you're able to look at it objectively.
Yeah, Kate touches on something really important. She was able to move on from it. What happens with a lot of kids is they become caretakers, and then they start forming relationships where they take second seat and always put themselves second to whoever they're with, which becomes problematic as they get older.
And that can play out in friendships, it can play out in romantic relationships with that similar pattern to taking second seat to somebody else.
Right. So it modifies their personality and affects how they relate to others.
Yes.
And does it affect their independence as a child?
I think what it affects is that sense of security. And so what's important, especially school-age children are working developmentally, they're working towards starting to become, it's the beginning of becoming more autonomous, about developing self-esteem, self-confidence. And so when you go back to you're in an environment where you don't know what's going on, sometimes because parents will be very, we hear this from the kids a lot, parents are fighting, they're being very aggressive towards each other, mean to each other, but then they tell the kids, oh, no, we're okay, everything's going to be okay. And so they're getting mixed messages, so they don't trust what they're experiencing either. So that's a very invalidating experience.
Well, one of the complicated things in court with psychologists and patients is confidentiality, because the court honors the law, and the law is that a patient's conversation with the therapist is confidential. So now you have one parent in court saying, oh, could you come in and testify?
Right.
And the other parent saying no, or maybe the child saying no,
Correct.
Right.
right? And so if you had situations like that where you were caught in between, and did you end up testifying or not testifying? And how important is it to protect the confidentiality of your patient?
We feel it's very important, and in fact, when parents come in to talk to us about receiving treatment for the family or the child or whoever, we make it very clear that our role is to be there for the patient or the client, and that if we get pulled in to the court to take sides, that's going to jeopardize the work we do. There are people who are specially trained to go to court, psychologists, who we would then refer them to, but we would do the treatment in-house. But we make that very clear.
So you would never disclose the confidential communication that you had with your patient in a courtroom?
Unless it was so meaningful, like there was a lot of, the reasons we breached confidentiality for, they were thinking about hurting themselves, thinking about hurting somebody else, those type of things. But what we get from a lot of kids and teens is, please don't tell mommy I said this, or please don't tell daddy I said this. If we go to court, are you going to tell them that I said this?
A lot of anxiety around that.
And if we say we may have to, then we take a big back step in their ability to trust and opening up to us.
But we've had positives in the sense that parents, even though they are going through, a very conflictual divorce, will, sign consents where we clarify that we are not going to be making any custody kinds of recommendations, and this is for the benefit of the child to express themselves. And we've been pretty lucky with not having to, the parents have respected that.
So it's interesting because I understand all this from the legal point of view. So sometimes we have problems with the child, or two children, or three children in a family, and we want them to get therapy. But we want the therapist to report on the progress. So what we do in court is we say to the judge, if the parties stipulate and consent, because the minor's consent is held by the parents,
Correct.
because they're a minor, then the therapist is allowed to report. And so we get that up front before the therapy begins.
Correct.
We get everyone to sign off on the consent, so the therapist could at least come in and say, Your Honor, the problem's with the mother. And the problem is that she's narcissistic, and she can't get past her anger. And because of that, she's, disrupting the child's ability to get well.
You're touching on something very important that I guess I should separate a little bit. And there are times when kids will want us to kind of have their back, because they're terrified of saying something like that mom is hitting me, or mom is doing this. Will you let people know? So in that case, absolutely. It's more so with the kids who say, please don't tell that I'm talking about this, about my father. So to differentiate that a little bit. There are times, exactly to what you're speaking on.
That's a very problematic area, because if a child tells you that a parent hit me, you're obligated under statute
That's right.
to report it.
And we do talk to that when any new client comes in, including children. Even when we're talking to the kids, we explain all of that. The things that we are able to keep, just be in the session, or the things that we cannot, that we're not allowed to do.
And it might not be hitting. It could be mom doesn't pay or dad doesn't pay any attention to me. And no matter what I try to do to get him to pay attention, he won't. Can you help me with that?
Or mom or dad's paying more attention to their boyfriend or their new child or something like that.
Okay, so it's kind of interesting, because if there's a problem, then Department of Child Family Services gets involved, and that's a whole other system. They start taking kids away from parents for neglect, and you have to defend yourself, and it's very complicated. It's even separate from the family court. So I have to tell you that this half hour went by so quick. I want to thank you, both doctors and Kate, for appearing today. It was a pleasure to have you. I'm going to invite you back again. I hope you'll come. I want to thank the KBEV staff. This show is completely produced by Beverly Hills High School students. They do an incredible job. And Romeo Carey, the director of it, is amazing. And we're so happy to be here, and we're so thankful. And we're so happy that our law office of Barry Fisher, has the opportunity to reach out, try to educate the community, and give them insights on do's and don'ts of divorce. So tune in next week. We're a weekly show. We'll be on the air And if you have any questions at the end of the program, you can email us any requests that you want us to discuss on the show. Thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.
We thank you for tuning in, and we invite you, our viewing audience, to participate in next week's conversation. On The Divorce Project, our goal is to help bring you the healthy outcome that your family deserves. So please email your questions to team@thedivorceproject.com or call us directly at the number on your screen.